Namaste and good evening, everyone. Welcome to our continuing series, Evenings with Sraddhalu. Namaste, Sraddhalu.
Namaste. Happy to be with all of you.
And I hope Narad had managed to join or not yet. Oh, he will be on soon. He just finished his recordings. Good evening, Narad. Look, he's with us. Namaste. I think you're muted. Can you see Narad? I think he's on,
Yes.
he's on mute.
We can. Please speak, Narad.
Something is
No,
happening.
we cannot hear. Anyway, we are able to see you. And you look glorious.
And maybe we can start with informing everyone that Narad is doing again on choir on ashram, in ashram school, where is the video room. I wish Narad could say more about it. So every Friday, 6:30 p.m., we all welcome you for Om Choir with Narad. And today we will continue the theme on sacred objects and their utilization with several more interesting questions that we receive and more insights. But before, I would like to address one question we received from Jason. He's asking, I want you to include me in your email messages you are sending about Mark's upcoming conference or any related interesting events that may be happening around the time in Aurobindo in Pondicherry. I would like to attend both conferences, but I'm sure if a place needs to be pre-booked or not. So please, Sraddhalu, inform us all about the outcome.
In the description today of today's talk, in the description, I have already put the link to the Facebook post of Mark, and there you will find a poster. The same poster will also be, I suppose, distributed, and we will ask friends to email them to their mailing lists. The information is very simple. It gives you the date, time, and location for the two talks. The first one is on 9th of February, Sunday, from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. at Savitri Bhavan. And the second is on a week later, on Sunday 16th, at the Shenbaga Hotel and Convention Center, the same place we had his talk last year. Again, 9 to 1 p.m. The overall theme being the same. We're treating it as two separate talks in a continuation. It's a two-part series on the theme of reincarnation. Although each will be reasonably independent if you cannot attend both. There is no prior registration. There is no prior requirement of any kind. You can just come straight to the venue. We have a broad idea of how many we expect, and so just come freely. There is no prior requirement of any kind. As regarding the first part of your question, to be on any emails, I made a conscious decision not to maintain email lists, because then that becomes difficult to manage. And the only thing I have is this platform of the YouTube channel, where any significant announcements would naturally be placed. Otherwise, I have no email lists, but I will be passing this on to a few friends who have email lists and ask them to circulate in their lists. But basically, it will be the same thing, the poster and the text. So please do look at the poster and you will have everything that you need. We can go to the next question.
From Sumana. Last week you mentioned about Mahakali being golden in color and Kali being black. Did you mean the color of the idol, the Murti, or is it the color of the deity in the subtle level? All the Kali temples I have seen, the Kali Murti is either black or dark blue. Even the Kali Murti in Dakshinashvar temple, where Sri Ramana Krishna Dev worshipped the Divine Mother, is completely black. Could you please clarify? Also, you mentioned that in some of the Kali temples, lower vital representations are worshipped. How to distinguish those? If I'm unknowingly visiting such temples and without understanding, if I worship and pray to the deity as the Divine Mother, am I opening myself to some lower force? If so, how to develop that sensitivity to differentiate? Please help me in understanding this. There are temples where Shakti is worshipped and animal sacrifices are performed, like Pashupati Nath in Nepal, Kali temples. What type of force are associated with this?
It's very important because, unfortunately, also a little controversial. So my comment about Mahakali being golden in color is the natural form as experienced in the higher worlds. Kali is, let's say, a minor representation or projection experienced generally in the vital worlds. And it is also a very specific aspect, Mahakali being much more comprehensive. To really appreciate the nature of Mahakali, the best would be to read Sri Aurobindo's description of the 4 aspects of the Divine Mother, and where he describes Mahakali, her working, and her consciousness. The description is so comprehensive, so vivid and powerful in transmission of the consciousness of that aspect of the Divine Mother, that just that will give you as if an intense, deep immersion and contact with that aspect of the Divine Mother, and you'll feel the difference. When you've experienced that quality of consciousness and you meet something different or even an inferior grade, you feel the difference. So when you ask about developing the sensitivity, I'm going to say you already have it. Just learn to respect it. When you feel a difference, when you feel something is not so clear, don't let your mind question and doubt your own sensitivity. And instead of saying, oh, I must be impure, I must be insensitive, just trust that you have a sensitivity. Perhaps at that point you're clouded also by the confusion that comes with large numbers of crowds of devotees and so on. Perhaps, but what you experience is real. Increasingly, as your deeper communion with the presence of the Divine Mother grows, with that the sensitivity will grow naturally. You will feel in certain spaces that what comes is too coarse or too cloudy or mixed or dark, and just trust that. Just because a temple is famous does not mean the presence there is of a very high spiritual kind. It can often be famous because it has a certain vital power. A vital power either to attract people or even sometimes to give them benefits. And it is generally transactional spaces which tend to become more powerful or famous, or which have larger numbers of visitors, tourists, or devotees, generally speaking. Because most people really are not concerned with pure spiritual spaces, because one does not always get material benefits or satisfaction of your desires in such spaces. So coming to the specific question about the Dakshineshwar temple, where Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa worshipped the Divine Mother. Yes, the idol there is black. We must also distinguish between what the conception of the carver is versus the quality of consciousness that is invoked, versus the quality of consciousness that you concentrate upon when you turn to that deity. And the 3 can be different. So the person who's carving may follow a very traditional idea or image and symbolism, which may even represent something of a lower, more materially accessible grade. The consciousness invoked may be lower or higher, and it can be completely unconnected to the form and color of the idol or even the material. And then when somebody sits to concentrate, what you tune into may be completely different also. So you could, for example, take a very crude physical symbol. What you concentrate upon, what you conceive of, may be something very high. And the symbol is at best a focal point, like a lens through which you look at something which is far and you feel it close. You use this as a point of a link. Or to put another symbol, perhaps more accessible, the mobile phone through which you speak to somebody may be an old model, it can be dirty, it can be full of grime from people who have touched it, but the quality of the contact that you have in the communication could be of a different order altogether and quite independent, dependent perhaps on the person you're speaking to, which has nothing to do with the grime on the tuning device, which is the mobile phone. So, if you are clear about these three things as being reasonably independent, then you don't worry too much about the physical idol being any color or form. It's the quality of the presence. You could even have a very deep spiritual presence invoked on something very simple and crudely formed. So, how to distinguish? Go only by your sensitivity. And increasingly, as your sensitivity develops, if you're exposed to many different things over time, you notice, oh, this space is clearer, that space feels coarser or darker. Just observe. Go multiple times and you will notice. Some places you come back with an elevated state, some places you don't come back with that, or there's nothing even. Simply observe, and with that the sensitivity will grow. When you are praying, that's why your question about going to some temple where the presence may not be very high, what is it that you are praying to? And that's the third thing which I was pointing to. What are you tuning into? And if you're tuning to the Divine Mother in your highest conception or feeling, it does not matter too much what is there. You may or may not feel comfortable with that, but what you tune to can be completely independent. I want to share here an interesting experience which was narrated to me by somebody in Orissa. He was from a family of priests, and he had a certain, let's say, opening and sensitivity to things occult. And he had a friend who was a practitioner of what passes for Tantra and low-grade ritualistic access to lower beings. And unfortunately, that passes a lot for Tantra, though it's not. But let's say he was into that kind of a worship, and he wanted to show his power, in other words, his power to control beings or access beings, to my friend who was from a priestly background. So he invited the friend to his place and said, I'm going to invoke Kali. So he was made to sit. The room was darkened, and this man began his chant and ritual. So in the middle of the darkness, of course, you don't see much, but you do feel presences. What my friend described was, at some point during the ritual, suddenly there was a strong footfall, as if somebody had jumped into the room physically and with the thump of the feet jumping onto the floor. And then he felt in front of him the rapid breathing of somebody. The classical image of Kali with the tongue stretched out and breathing to as fierce, destroying the evil forces, etc. So it was of that grade, but there was this rapid breathing. So immediately his first reaction was of a kind of a fear, because obviously some being had manifested. And then he said, because he had this background of Sri Aurobindo and the mother, he said, but why should I be afraid? I should not be afraid. And remembering the Divine Mother, he turned to this being who was in front of him and said, why should I be afraid of you? You too are an emanation of the Divine Mother. And so I bow down to the Divine Presence which is within you. And he concentrated on the Divine Mother and prayed to the Divine Mother. Within a few seconds, this whole presence, fear-giving presence, and all the drama and sound associated with it simply stopped. His friend who was doing the ritual realized that something had happened and his ritual had been neutralized. He switched on the light and was very upset, very angry. He realized something had happened which was outside his control, and told him, what did you do? And then refused to have contact with him. Now I give this as an example because it shows you straight away the difference. Even if there is a lower grade of being or presence, what do you concentrate upon? And in this case, since he cut through that form and addressed it directly to the Divine Mother and invoked the Divine mother into this form, immediately the higher presence dissolved the lower grade. The lower being was either dissolved or withdrew and could not bear that light or that presence. There's another example, not of such a negative type. My teacher, MP Pandit's sister, Mitra Akka, some of you might have known her, used to, at some point, because she was a little open to these things, used to have a very friendly contact with certain beings, dwarves or elves of the kind. They were friendly, they were helpful. Sometimes they would tell her things, or sometimes they would nudge her and say, "Oh, the milk is overflowing." And so one of them particularly, she was referring to as Chotappa, little one, in a affectionate way. And at some point, when she was going to meet the mother, she had this little thing following her. And when she approached the mother's room, physically, she was entering the mother's room. When she approached the mother's room and was about to enter, this being stopped. It refused to threshold of the door to the mother's room. And she found it unusual. And later she mentioned it to Panditji, who then mentioned it to the mother. And the mother laughed and she said, naturally, if they come in, they will be dissolved. It's interesting that when beings of a lower grade, and they could be benevolent or malevolent, it doesn't matter, when they meet the direct luminosity, light of the divine consciousness, which is large, vast, even infinite, and of a far greater grade of power of consciousness, when they meet that directly, their smallness, littleness, or the grade at which they are is too much for them to bear. Either they get overwhelmed or they dissolve in the intensity of that light. So the message I am conveying to you is always your concentration, your consciousness, your invocation should be to the highest conception and relationship that you have with the Divine Mother. My personal view, and this I share only as a personal view, it is for you to choose what works for you, is that I never concern myself with specific aspects of the Mother, or particularly these secondary or even tertiary emanations. Even if you go to a temple, or if I go to a temple where there may be something like this, my concentration is always on the one highest Divine Mother, in the Veda described as the Mother of the Gods. With or without name, it is irrelevant. For me personally, I see the Mother as the individual aspect of this Divine Mother. And I always relate to her in her cosmic form, even if there is the individual aspect in between as the link. It is always to that I relate, irrespective of that particular deity form associated with the temple. I go straight to that, and through the form or with or without the form, it does not matter. But you have to see what works for you. So this is general observation. You've asked about temples where there is animal sacrifice. And you've mentioned Pashupati Nath, which is a very famous temple in Nepal, Kathmandu. What types of forces are associated with this? Always, wherever there is animal sacrifice, you can be sure it is a vital being, a vital force. But it may not always be associated with the main deity of the temple. So as in the case of Pashupati Nath, I happened to be there. It's a long time ago, more than 20-25 years. But I happened to be there. In the main temple, the presence is different. At the place where they do the sacrifice, it's very different. And what you have there is quite dark and low. Always, where anything that demands animal sacrifice, blood, or other forms of material, it represents a very low grade of vital being who use that substance which is released, particularly the denser grade of the vital substance, ectoplasmic or subtle physical, as a means to feed on, first of all, and then also as a means to act upon the material domain, either to influence, to act, to help, or whatever, to interfere. And it could be aside from the main deity, which could be reasonably clear or pure, which may be of a higher vital grade or not, I don't know. But I'm pointing out it could be separate, or if it is a temple where it is directly done with the deity, you can be sure it has to do with something of a very low grade of the vital world. So just a general observation. We can move to the next question.
From Maurice. A few years ago, I was in Pondicherry Together with more than 1,000 other people, I waited the whole night in the street behind the ashram to visit Mother's room. At dawn, I heard a woman behind me say, Surya. A few people bowed to the sun that was rising above the sea. So I got another glimpse of the Indian soul that is much more open to spirit in nature. In the West, mainstream Christianity has erased this natural sense of the sacred. My mind is still confused about different qualities of the sacred as it manifests in holy rivers, the Ganges, for example, mountains, animals, in cows. Is it part of the play of involution of consciousness in creation and of invocation?
Yes. Sitting in the crowd, and perhaps very likely the sunrise must have been just in line with the road so that you could see the sun rising. And obviously, you are in a state which is also aligned to and sensitive to the presence, and in that state, often in everything, one can feel or sense the sacred. In this case, even if for some of the people, it might have been a more habitual, ritualistic sense, still, generally speaking, in India, as would be in most old cultures, there is the sense of the sacred with things in nature. But still, I want to make a difference, and this difference is extremely important. A lot of what passes for the sacred in shamanic traditions relates to beings and presences of a very low grade. I've had occasion to meet with some people who were part of the Native American tradition, some people who were part of the Native African tradition, and others from various spaces. Over the years, I've had meetings with many of them. And through some interaction, the first impression I had was that much of what they were tuning to in the shamanic practice were beings of a lower grade. For example, you could go into a forest or a mountain or a river, whatever that form might be, and tune into a specific presence that belongs to that place, that location, or that river or mountain. But what grade do you tune into? And very often these are beings that preside over that location. Generally these are beings that are very low, close to the material domain, close to the physical world, from the vital. And it is to these that much of the shamanic interchange takes place. Quite unlike what you see in India, where from the Vedic times, the sun, the physical sun, was seen as a symbol of Surya or Pushan, and the various names associated, 12 names even for the sun, which relate to specific aspects or powers of the divine creative consciousness, the light of the truth, of which our physical sun is a symbol and representation in the material world. And from the beginning, from the Vedic stage itself, we find this idea that you don't worship the physical sun, you worship that of which the physical sun is a representation and a symbol. This has persisted from the Veda, through the Upanishadic stage, through the later forms of the Puranic stage, and all the way to the present. So when in India they speak of worship of the sun, it is not that kind of a low grade association with a lower vital being or power. The idea is always to something which is spiritual in essence. Even when they worship the moon, it is Chandra Deva, again an aspect of the divine consciousness represented ideally at least in a spiritual domain, of which you could have reflections in the vital worlds and so on. Yes, there are perhaps specific deities which are associated with locations, as you will have the Grama Devata, it is called the deity of the village or a mountain or a specific location in a river and so on. These would represent lower vital beings. But generally in the culture, the spiritual imprint is so strong that when they speak of the sun, it is to that, Surya, Pushan, or other Mitra and others, which are aspects of the sun, aspects of the spiritual truth in its expression, 12. And again, it's symbolic. You see the same idea of 12 in the mother's symbol. So Although it may seem to somebody from outside, oh, these are nature worshippers, there's a huge difference in what it is that they worship through the natural symbol. In the European space, it is important to recognize when Christianity came in, it erased, you say, the natural sense of the sacred. Yes, that also happened. But there was an evolutionary reason and purpose in that happening. What had happened was, in large parts of Europe, the worship had already declined to a grade of very low vital beings or vital powers. So in the nature worship, what they call paganism, much had been reduced to that lower vital grade in forms, in symbols, in meaning. And so the relationships had become so low that if Europe was to awaken to a higher spiritual truth, somehow this had to be broken. And what came through the militant form of Christianity, which destroyed paganism, suppressed, even tortured and killed people on the basis of that, was as if a force which was, or the truth behind the force was this attempt perhaps. And one can look at it this way: the evolutionary power used a certain very crude, coarse, destructive tendency for a purpose, so that today somehow that low-grade access has been freed. If you look at some of the Teutonic deities, they even demanded human sacrifice. And much of what passed under the general category of witchcraft involved human sacrifice. Though there was a lot of good which came, knowledge which came from the traditions, from the opening to knowledge of herbs and deeper healing powers, which also got destroyed in attempting to exterminate witchcraft. So we'd see a lot of good destroyed, but you have to understand behind it, there was an attempt, or there was a tendency of an evolutionary power to free Europe from this lower grade. And Christianity pointed to, again, the idea of one God, in the process losing the aspect of the Divine Mother, which comes indirectly, and so on, many corrective tendencies in the subsequent lineages, let's say, or sects of Christianity. So this is the background in which you can understand what happened there. But again, coming back to India, the sense of the sacred in the Ganga, or in specific mountains, not all mountains, or specific creatures as cows, it comes from the Vedic symbol. And not all mountains are seen to have the same spiritual presence as, for example, Mount Kailash, which is considered to be especially more sacred. Not all rivers are considered as sacred as the Ganga, which has something very specific and special, and so on. So some of these came from a direct perception that there were such sacred deities or rivers, or a deity that incarnated or aligned with a physical part of nature. So, having made this distinction, then it's a question of your sensitivity to validate or experience. We can go to his next question.
Maurice has another question. This week was the commemoration of liberation of Auschwitz. Some time ago, I visited the place. I still felt sorrow, but I had also the impression that there was light above the place. How can such places otherwise be healed?
It's interesting what you observed. I can share my own experience also, but also the background for those who might not know. Auschwitz was one of the German concentration camps during the second Great War, World War they call, but and during it, one of the characteristics of many of these concentration camps were that people who were rounded up as inferior races, or which the elite Nazi considered to be not part of their elite world, were sent to these camps. Quite a bit of them, in this case, were of Jewish origin. And the camps themselves, when you see them even today, are quite fascinating in the extent to which it was structured, disciplined, organized, which was the character of the, German people. The Nazi force took that power and gave it a different direction. That was all. But what happened there Of course, many died, many were killed, many were also in the last stage of the war when there was collapse of the entire food supply chain. Many died of starvation or lived on the brink of starvation. Many were shot dead and buried, and so on. Quite a lot of things happened in those spaces in concentration camps. So this is one of those where we are told that a lot of people were killed, specifically in a very brutal form. Having been there, my experience was similar. So there were two elements to that. One, I saw that the actual data of what was popularly presented was different from the actual events. So it was not primarily designed as a space for killing people. You find there were places where they had theatre, they had musicians, they had an orchestra, people playing football on weekends and things like that. So the first objective was actually to create a space where prisoners who would be, let's say, captive workers for the industries would be assembled. And most of the concentration camps were designed like this. You had a people who were captured and turned into slaves effectively. But the slaves had to be kept healthy so that they could work better. And so there was a whole design and a structure to it. And then with that came also the torture and other experiments, which Auschwitz was associated with the MK Ultra experiments, where people were pushed to the brink of death in order that their mind could be broken and turned into a blank slate to be reprogrammed. So these were very intense, very painful experiments in which the elite developed the basic technology which became later much more refined through hypnosis and other means, which passes today as MK Ultra, for reprogramming the human mind and making you think as they choose to think. So a lot of such things happened also. So yes, there is an imprint of suffering, but my impression was so much of the sorrow actually came with the visitors who came and who brought in a weight upon what was there. And similar to what you felt, above that was a light. Where that light comes is not obvious, but perhaps the impression I had was that even as there was the struggle below, there was a light from above which came to protect, to help and support those who were suffering. And if they could tune in, and if they had a spiritual opening, they would receive that help despite the most difficult or grim physical circumstances. You will remember Sri Aurobindo's help during the Second World War with several people. John Kelly I've narrated before, we have discussed this with Narad, was one example, and there is the Romanian general who wrote a book later in which he describes meeting Aurobindo Ghosh. He remembers Aurobindo Ghosh at the time when he was being tortured, and the presence came of Sri Aurobindo to help him to survive the torture. And in the book called Lost Footsteps by Silviu Crăciunas. Crăciunas? Is that how you pronounce it?
Yes, correct.
Crăciunas, okay. So there were many such people who felt Sri Aurobindo's help. But what would happen in all such spaces, wherever there, even if there were a few people who asked for help, there would be the light and the presence. Even to the extent, I would say, as powerful would be the light as might be the darkness below in order to be able to overcome the darkness and help. So perhaps it is this that you felt. And I want to point this out especially. It's an interesting observation. Not
My
everyone
brother
senses
just
that.
went last week there, and he sent me some pictures. So
Uh-huh.
yeah,
That's interesting.
he felt the same, that it's something has so special, the feeling. Perhaps,
Yes,
as you said, is the protection and the light
yes.
came from above.
It's fascinating, fascinating. One would have expected much more of the darkness, but it is quite different. But again, this is to remind you that
It
whatever
could be also
yes,
because people themselves being in that state, they would invoke that presence to
yes,
support. So their prayer and their
yes. Even if a few people invoked, there would be immediately the ability for the presence and help to manifest and become tangible and accessible. So I'm placing this as an example because, and generalizing now, for all of us, whatever your difficulty, whatever the circumstances you might be going through in life, even the worst, when you call, you have the help. And despite the most extreme material circumstances, the spiritual help can be called upon and it will make a difference. If nothing else, to you personally, and if possible to your material circumstances and even to a material collective. We can go to the next.
From Kalpesh, we have a note. There are two guidelines that the mother gives when facing negative energies. First, never fear, as that opens to attack. Second, invoke the mother and place her in between.
Yes. So last time we had a whole discussion about different kinds of entities, energies which might be present in certain spaces or not. And there was some discussion about protection also. But this was an important point which Kalpesh has pointed out and which we should have raised. Whenever you feel a difficult situation, and I was giving examples of some temples where the vibrations are very low, even the being was of a very low grade, never allow fear to affect you. You sense it, you say, okay, you choose not to go. It's a choice you make. But the moment you have fear, then the fear is your means of opening to the attack. Recall the example I gave earlier of my friend in Orissa who, first feeling fear, he was able to overcome that and attune himself to the Divine Mother. As a consequence, the being, the inferior deity, whatever it was either dissolved or repelled, could not affect, could not dominate, could not influence. So remember this as a general rule that the Mother gives: never fear. It is always fear which opens to attack. And build in yourself this basic idea that nothing can hurt you, nothing can affect you, because you have within you the presence of the Divine Mother. You turn to that, cling to that, invoke that, and nothing can affect you, despite whatever external threats might seem to be or might pretend to be. Do not believe them. Believe rather the truth of the presence within you. So first, never fear. And the second, when dealing with such influences, and sometimes it can be very awkward when you have human beings of a very crude or low grade dominating, pushing, manipulating, or even trying to exercise a controlling influence on you. Invoke the Mother's presence in between. If you like, visualize, feel her like a wall, like a protection, like a shield in between you and whatever it is that you feel harmful or dangerous. And when you open and place her in between, immediately you will feel, first, the tension, the pressure of that negative will be immediately neutralized by her presence. You will feel her rather than that. And the second from then would be either that dissolves, dissipates, withdraws, but ceases to be effective in any way on you. So let this be for all of us a point of reference of prior practice of aligning your state of awareness to these things. First, never fear. Second, immediately invoke in between the Mother's presence. How you conceive of her, with image, with a name, with form, with presence, with just an awareness, with or without form, doesn't matter. Whatever works for you is useful. Go to the next.
From Madhuri, I have visited a saint's samadhi, which is still carrying energy. After coming from there, I experienced pregnancy without any reason. It was so tranquil that it could only be felt. Was it the energy of that divine soul or any message? I did not get it.
Okay. So often one has the association of quality of smell, quality of touch, or even other forms associated with presences. Remember last time I spoke about how there is a densification in the atmosphere using the support of perfumes, or even within you, in your material vital energies, even a formation of substance which can be of a kind of atmosphere of bacteria or even of perfume. And these are gradations which are very close to the subtle physical and physical. So yes, it can often happen when you go to a sacred space, you register the purity of the presence as a perfume. And if something of that presence sticks to you, you may even have the perfume stay with you for no material or external reason. That can happen. But again, it's not a measure of the spirituality. It can even come from a vital presence, which is reasonably material. So by itself, the perfume is not an evidence, but it is still an evidence generally of some quality of purity depending on the quality of the perfume. When you go to a place which is not so pure, not so clear, you'll often have the feeling or smell of something which is crude, coarse, ugly, or even repulsive kind of smell. And so it can be indicative, but it is not definitive. Go to the next.
From Tutun, do the different pictures of the mother and Sri Aurobindo reflect certain vibrations? Like in one, the vibe is love, another is power.
Yes. Generally, the mother said that when a photo was taken, it captured the particular quality or aspect which was at that point on the front. So we have, particularly on certain days of worship, puja days we call them, when the mother would, in response to the insistence of some of the devotees, she would come down and even embody that aspect of the mother. So there are photographs taken of Maheshwari aspect, Mahakali, Mahalakshmi and Mahasaraswati. And you can feel that. You can feel the quality in those images. She did encourage some people to use it in that way. There was one particular photograph which she said represented that aspect of Annapurna, that is one who is in plenitude of nourishment, food and multiplicity of things, and where the plenitude flows. And that particular photograph she gave to Dyuman Bhai and asked it to be placed in the main hall where food was distributed in the dining room. So yes, there were things like that. There's another of the Mahakali force which she suggested to people as something to place for protection. So I remember as a child, when we were lying down and from the bed, you looked up and straight away right there was a photograph of the mother slightly tilted forward, quite close to the ceiling, that my mother had placed. And it was this image, very powerful look. And only now I understand, or later I understood, that it was the aspect of the Mahakali, and my mother had placed it as a way of protection for the children. It's interesting. So, yes, the photographs does capture that aspect, and one can use it to that benefit. But also a lot depends on what you do with the photo. You may choose to allow what comes naturally with the image and the aspect, and it's an aspect. Or you can, as you concentrate, go behind and beyond the aspect to the fullness of the Divine Mother beyond. And then it doesn't matter which image it is you relate to, what comes through will be full, complete, or representing that power, that aspect which is most needed for you now. And I personally tend to do that even when looking at these aspects, or you can choose to relate to that specific aspect also. Go to the next.
From Shrishmid, there's a lot of emphasis on keeping physical purity in sacred spaces, but isn't it keeping purity of thoughts more important?
Yes, certainly that also can make a difference. A lot depends on what it is that you're holding in the sacred space. For example, when you go to the Samadhi in the ashram, in the Sri Aurobindo ashram, even if within your thought you don't have too much of a clarity or purity, entering the space often there is such a dense presence that automatically your thoughts change. If there's something crude or coarse, it just has no place. It changes completely your state. In many who are not even used to being quiet in mind, being in that space, they feel the presence, the mind simply spontaneously falls silent. They may be conscious or they may not, and it doesn't matter too much. The effect of the spiritual presence is immediate and automatic. So, on one side you can say you go to that space for that support, isn't it? So you can't say first you must have a purity of thought before you can go. Obviously, you don't want to deliberately create confusion of thought and then want to go there. So yes, it is a two-way relationship. If too many people come with mixed thoughts, mixed feelings, mixed emotions, or who want to throw their desire bundles on the sacred space and say, hey, give me this, give me that, and they throw that, then obviously there's a dilution or a mixture which can form, which is typically the case in temples where people come with those reasons and there has to be a purificatory ritual. But remember, I described last time how these are formations of an occult kind. And so they are dependent on the mechanism, the machinery that holds the purity. In an essentially spiritual space, such a thing may or may not be required at all. But yes, it helps that you maintain physical cleanliness and if you maintain a certain purity of intention. But most important is the essential aspiration. You go with a pure aspiration. You are as if aligning to the purpose of the presence. You open to it, and then not only it flows into you, in the act of you flowing, it flowing into you, and you invoking, it also amplifies and intensifies. So the presence grows in strength when you approach with a pure aspiration to receive, or when you invoke with that way. So it can be a mutually supportive relationship, that you receive the spiritual help, but your purpose of aspiration helps to densify and intensify and hold the purity of the space naturally and even effortlessly. Go to the next.
From Trinetra, nowadays the black and white photos of Mother and Sri Aurobindo comes in color, added color. Is that okay?
Yes. So I've seen people who paint the photographs, and then of course a lot depends on their artistic skill. Some of them just fill a flat color, some of them try to create a shade on the basis of a black and white photo at the back. We have many tools today. With AI, I'm sure one can recover any kind of color, image, etc. In my personal preference, I don't feel comfortable with that. When you have an actual color photograph of the mother and you have a colorized photo and you look at the two, you can feel the artificiality. And to me personally, the artificiality forms like a screen in between what you feel in the direct photograph and what comes to you. So let me put it in other words. If the quality of the print is really bad, it's difficult for you to tune in to the presence. Or to put it another way, the presence does not have a sufficient material support to be able to act more freely. It goes both ways. So the form and the quality of the form and print, etc., does make a difference. Now, many people who don't, you see, everyone has today access to very powerful image processing tools. But many people who don't know how to use those tools, you take a scanned picture. First of all, in scanning, you have already flattened. Some of the blacks have become more black, some of the whites have become more white. Then you take it up in your software and you do what is called a histogram analysis to spread the colors, to spread the shades, even if it's a black and white image. The result often is a further distortion of the gradations of black and white. And sometimes you have blocky patches which appear. And when you take that to the printing press, again there's a further distortion. If you don't know how to process these correctly, you can lose a lot. And what you may get in print would be finally very high quality of print of a content which is very flattened in colors or even in black and white shades. And in my experience, perhaps it comes from my association, I don't know. In my experience, that distorts or limits or somehow compromises the fullness of what flows through or what I can tune in to. Of course, at some point you use that as a point of support. You close your eyes, you go beyond what the photo contains and touch that which is behind. Then it doesn't matter. But if you're looking to feel in the photograph or through the photograph and make the link with a more material support, I do feel it distorts or limits in some way. It acts like a screen which brings in the person who has colorized their consciousness or something that they have put into it as a layer that prevents the full transparency. My preference is to keep the photographs as they were originally, as close as possible to the original, and just stay with that. But perhaps with AI, many people will do many things. We have recently an AI that was circulated by somebody where they took photographs, one view of Swami Vivekananda, Sri Aurobindo and many other, and turned it into a 3D image with the person moving the head and blinking and so on. Obviously, the movement and the blinks were artificial. That was picked up by the way the AI chose for any ordinary human. And it did not feel correct. Of course, for some, it was a very powerful experience even, because suddenly you go beyond the actual image to that which is behind. It all depends on your experience. So I would simply say observe and then do what you find helpful. Go to the next.
From Connor. what should we do when we use herbs or incenses or medications? I feel they're not directly with Mother's presence that is helping in its purest form. Do I pray to the Mother inside the plant, such as when I take ashwagandha for health or burn camphor?
Well, simply I would say if you don't feel it, or if you feel it comes in the way, simply avoid it. Or use it for a different purpose. So you take a medicine, you don't think at that point that this is a spiritual thing. You take it as a biological or life vital medicine. So you use the camphor for the effect it has, which is to purify on a certain vital physical or subtle physical grade of vibration. Do that if it helps you, if you feel it helps you. Or you burn certain kinds of incense if you feel it uplifts or purifies the space. At the end of the day, go by your experience. Even if it is not directly supportive of a higher spiritual experience, if you feel it purifies, why not? If you feel it helps you tune into the higher, certainly. But if you feel it interferes, then drop it. It all depends on your experience. Always focus on what you can gain in terms of the actual contact with the presence. That's what matters much more. Even if the physical space does not have a purification by camphor or other means, when you feel the presence and when the presence densifies to a material level, it will do everything far more effectively even by such means. But if you feel such means help and build a prior basis of purity, and then you do the invocation, why not, if that works for you? I'm sorry, the solution I'm offering you is not a set formula. I'm saying follow your experience and see what works for you. There are in fact many perfumes which could be nice in the quality of the perfume, but where you will not feel the alignment to the spiritual presence. And it's difficult to describe how or why, but I would simply say go with the experience. That's what matters. Next question.
From Spirit Bird. What about friend or friends who enjoy being in the home, especially in your prayer or meditation room, of someone devoted to Sri Aurobindo and the Mother? These friends not consciously connected to the Lord or the Mother. Would this dilute the atmosphere? Possibly something in such friends may open to Sri Aurobindo and the Mother if they enjoy being among their photos, their energy, their books, etc.
A lot depends on the state and intention with which they come. If somebody feels the presence, respects it, and cherishes and values that immersion or that exposure to the presence, it does not matter their background. Because again, I'm going back to who is the Mother, what Sri Aurobindo and the Mother represent. They represent the divine consciousness, not an aspect, not a limited form, focus, around which you have to say, this is this and that is not this. Since they represent the divine presence in whatever way, by whatever sensitivity, with whatever tradition that a person may be following or believing in, if they feel the presence and respect it, I would simply say it is worthwhile. And them being there, feeling and respecting the presence and enjoying it would be an aid, would even help perhaps for the presence to become more material and established. So in this case, it doesn't matter what tradition, what belief, what background one comes from. You feel the presence. On the contrary, if they come with no sensitivity to the presence, but they keep quiet with the respect, though they don't feel, that's still fine. In such a case, I would say they have no sensitivity on the surface, but inside there is a sensitivity that they are not aware of. And perhaps they feel nourished. And I know a lot of people who do that. They don't know why, they don't know what happens. They just say, oh, I feel good when I go there, I feel peaceful, I like it. And it means the surface is blocked, but the inner is sensitive. And on some level, one would even say the inner soul and its sensitivity feels nourished in that presence. And it is that which brings them there again and again. But there's a third, which would be the opposite, where they come, they don't feel, and they are not only insensitive, but disrespectful, or bring a vibration which is contrary, that you feel dilutes or contradicts the sense of the sacred and the presence. In such cases, it is best to avoid. Now, who it is, what it actually does not matter. I've seen people who come from very simple backgrounds, They may be coming as workers who came, let's say, as a plumber or as a electrician. They come into that sacred space because they have to fix a light bulb, and they feel something and they are respectful. It's fine. Sometimes you have to remind them. They may not feel they're too busy doing it mechanically. You say, hey, you're about to enter a sacred space, so I'll appreciate if you keep quiet and maintain the sanctity. And if they have the sensitivity, they feel immediately, they look and they say, ah, yes. And they feel that, and with respect as they do the work. And that's precious. But if they come with something, or if anybody comes with the contrary, then the best is simply to take them out, either by giving the reason, look, this is sacred space, let's talk outside, or use some other reason to get them out without needing to say it. That generally, and you'll feel the atmosphere is disturbed, it does not like it, it is affected in some way.
We have two questions which are very related. One from Shrivali and the second from Maya. First, can you speak about weapons of the Mahabharata war? Each one represented a godhead. Isn't it like the war of the gods? Is the gods so mantra bound that they oblige anyone who ever invokes them? I'm also curious about Narayana Astra. Isn't it Narayana, supreme godhead, who could Ashvatthama invoke and even use it? And from Maya, in the Mahabharata, there are plenty of sacred objects that seem magical to us today, such as celestial weapons, flying chariots, Kamadhenu, the fulfilling cow, Arjuna's magical bow, Gandiva, or even the Aksha Patra, the magical vessel that provided an unlimited supply of food for the Pandava brothers. Were these sacred objects symbolic or real? If real, were they divine gifts, alien or advanced human technology?
Whether they represent technology, alien or human or otherwise, I cannot always comment, but I'll give a general response to some of these, and they are all quite different. So first part of the question is regarding the weapons which were invoked, sometimes by the use of a mantra, sometimes associated with a physical object, combined with mantra or without. And obviously when you see that somebody uses it, anybody can use that weapon to destroy. In some cases, you have to have a particular competence. Someone must have gifted you the weapon or initiated you into the mantra, and so there's a transmission of a force or a power by which alone you are able to exercise it. Or if you forget the mantra, then you are unable to invoke the weapon. Or if the power was given to you, somebody could withdraw the power. So all of these things describe powers which are not specifically bound to a state of consciousness. They may require a certain competence of utilization, but they are not bound to a state of consciousness, and this can be misused or used for purposes to harm or to help. And obviously, therefore, they are not spiritual innately. They represent powers which could be considered maybe of a grade which is vital physical, and there were very advanced technologies, or I would say there are very advanced technologies which in current humanity have been lost or forgotten, or more correctly, withdrawn, which used to be present with them, which are still retained or known in certain alien, non-human civilizations, planets, or otherwise, even on Earth, within those communities. And otherwise, a variation of these would be something which is purely vital with the power of a mantra. Sometimes with physical support, sometimes without. So I'm looking at first this whole category of weapons, as they are called, astra. When invoked, let's say something which is purely of mantric basis. So somebody gives you the mantra and thus transmits a certain force or a quality, a power. You receive that. The power is associated with you. The power given to you is what is being is what is going to be released. The trigger for its release is the mantra. Sometimes to be spoken precisely with words, sometimes to be done with an intonation, sometimes associated with certain gestures. If you think about it, why would this pattern of words activate this? It's not a one-to-one correspondence, as in the case of many mantras. There may be an alignment, but much more behind it is the intention. And the key word is like a magical key which activates with the intention. It activates and releases that power, or even directs it with your intention. So at the end of the day, behind it is an intention, a power held which you never created, which was given to you, and the mechanism to activate this and direct it through your intention. If you think about this, it's not too different from a basic thought or emotion that you have. Remember this, we mentioned in passing just a few sessions ago, when the mother said to someone who asked, how do you practice occultism? And mother said simply, every time you have a thought or an emotion with some clarity or concentration, you are practicing occultism, because the thought emotion goes out and has an occult influence on circumstances or on people. How is that different from this? Fundamentally, let's say now you sit down and you say, I'm going to create this. I'm going to finish this in so much time. And you put a strong intention of your will and desire and plan of clarity of mind and maybe a lot of emotional energy to say, whatever happens, I'm going to put, I must, I need to. And there's a huge emotional, energetic investment. That now becomes the energy that you put to fulfill, to realize a certain project which drives it. The act of doing this and the act of releasing this energy, emotion, will also attract emotions and energies from others which are similarly aligned. So the fact that you've held this or released this will trigger, through a ripple effect, attract similar qualities and have physical consequences of circumstances. Let's take another example. You invoke a help and ask for a help for a particular project. You invoke a spiritual light or presence and release that for purpose of protection, for purpose of smooth execution of project. Again, that has the effect on material circumstances, on the minds, on the emotions of people, and a ripple effect even on things which are connected with the project. Now take a negative form of this. You hate somebody, you dislike somebody, and you put out a very strong intention to harm the person. You wish them ill, you wish them to be harmed, and you've released that. Essentially, the mechanism behind is exactly the same in all these three. The first being the weapon which was used, and the second being the positive intent, the third being the negative intent. Essentially behind it, all three are exactly the same processes and principles. The only difference is the weapon given to you had already a very powerful gathered energy force built up by somebody else who had a very special skill or power and then given to you. Now I'm going to go a little deeper into this. Your thought and emotion released has the content of your consciousness. If in your mind there is a very great power of conception, visual or otherwise, idea conception. If in your emotions there's a great force of vitality and an organized and intense power of vitality, what you conceive and release, good or bad, will be very effective and will have great effective force and precise results. The clarity of your awareness, conception and idea will bring clarity and precision. The force and energy that you release through your emotions or vital energies or even desires would give to it a strength and force of effectivity. Which grade depends on which grade you have it organized, formed and released. If you want it to be really effective, you would go through all the levels, from the clarity of mind at an essential level, through the gradations of idea, through the gradations of form of thought, through the gradation of life energies of a higher grade of inspiration and a lower grade of effectuation and push and influence, and even to be able to seize upon other people's emotions and energies to guide them or move them. All these grades aligned would make for the most effective and dramatic and precise outcome. Now, you could do this in a person who is thus organized on all these levels, so such a person would be more effective generally in whatever projects they take up or they manage. So the manager's quality of consciousness makes a huge difference to the effectivity of the team. Now, it could be the manager is not very good, but team members compensate for his lack, and still it will work. But my point is, someone has to hold to be able to navigate and make effective. I give a good example for this would be Elon Musk. Tremendous power of intellect, conceptualization, intelligence, organized, structured, with depth of insight, huge vitality, which is also massive in intensity, power, width, large, vital, and power, so wide, effective power, but also restrained and controlled, not haphazardly thrown. But of course, such people, when they have huge vitalities, they have occasional outbursts. When they get upset, you can have that also, and then they can punch you with their anger. But in this case, it is structured, controlled largely. And so what he's able to build, do, the way he's able to inspire a team, guide a team, even lead a team, wield a team, is remarkable, and therefore his effectivity in life. And this is something all of us could build given enough time, etc. But once you've understood this is your requirement, and the outcome I'm not looking at good or bad. If somebody could form such a structure, and the word we will use is formation, a formation that has a clear form from mind down through the vital to something which is almost subtle physical. You create this, energize it, and now you hold it as a tool, a weapon, a machine. Yantra is the term. But it is subtle physical, or it is mental, vital, subtle physical. You want a physical outcome, it must come down to a level which is almost subtle physical. If you want only a mental outcome, if you want a physical outcome, you must bring it down to the level which is almost subtle physical. If you want only a mental outcome, you don't need that. A pure mental thought projected would be enough. And this is often what many yogis do when they influence humanity. They put out a thought, they put out an emotion, even a current in the collective consciousness, and humanity is swept, directed, redirected, etc., affected generally. But you want a physical result, it must come down to a grade which is almost physical, either in what you project or through somebody that you influence. So Sri Aurobindo influenced Churchill during the Second World War, even for strategic outcomes. But it was Churchill who provided the rest of the link for, let's say, ordering his troops or strategic changes in the war strategy.
Excuse me, something happened with your microphone.
Is it clear now?
Yes, you just mentioned Churchill, and then...
So Churchill, for example, was the link. Sri Aurobindo would inspire him on a higher level, and then he became the means, the instrument for then materializing what was communicated to the troops or as a strategy within the war council and so on. But otherwise, if you had to intervene in a more direct, what we would call miraculous way, you might have to densify to a level which is almost material. You remember that incident? I'm digressing a bit, but it will help to understand this. There was this incident which was narrated to us by Vishwanath Da. He was at that time a young man who was doing the recording of the mother's talks in the playground. And he narrated how at one point the mother was in the middle of a talk. As she spoke, she paused in the middle of a sentence, eyes closed, head bent down, body slumped, and she stayed nearly 20 minutes like this, during which time the body was as if shaking, shivering from cold. So people didn't know what to do, but it was known that sometimes she might go into trance, so everybody waited. And after 20 minutes, she again opens eyes and continues exactly where she left off in the middle of the sentence and completes her talk. At the end of it, she says, "You might have noticed perhaps that in between I would have gone into a trance and my body was shivering." And she says, why? She says, it happened at that moment that there was a yogi in the Himalayas who was in grave physical danger, and he prayed to the Divine Mother for help. And then she says, because I am here on earth, the call came to me. She put out the help required. But the nature of the intervention required a material intervention. So what she said was she had to go out of her body and from her subtle body materialize her body to a physical level of vibration to be able to intervene and help him. As a consequence, her materialized body experienced the full cold of the Himalaya, the region she was in. And generally when one does that, the subtle body projects and materializes. The materiality of the subtle body's materialization is directly of the grade of substance of our primary physical body. And a damage done there will actually damage this. If that one is killed, this dies. It immediately transfers whatever injury is there onto this, because it's the same material substantially. It is the same thing with an extended substance, that's all. So the experience of the shivering of the cold was affecting her gross physical body here. The ease with which she could do this is testament to the mastery that she had of these capacities and skills. But what I want to point to here is when it required a material intervention, a degree of materialization was necessary. So all of this is to say that the nature of the power you have put out, and the weapon in this case is the general term astra. If it has to have a specific result, you build the gradations, and once formed, it holds as a formation. Now this was a technology very highly developed by certain beings. They still exist among certain extraterrestrial beings who are very highly evolved. They may still exist among certain human beings who represent a capacity of this kind. I give another example of this, which the mother did again with very spontaneous ease. This I've mentioned before, when Lalji Bhai, one of the disciples, businessman, was starting a sugar mill near Pondicherry. The mother gave a lot of help. At that time, Mother Nature had offered to collaborate in the mother's work in the transformation. So mother drew upon the help repeatedly and with many miraculous outcomes. So they didn't get water, for example. They were digging many places, they were not getting water, and you can't have the sugar mills without large supply of water. So mother asked for the map. She concentrated and placed a mark and then said, dig here. And Lalji Bhai told us they dug, they hit a gushing force of water so strong it shot out by its own pressure, and then they went further to a second level and a third level. And then when he told us this, it was already 30-40 years after. And he said, to this day, it's gushing water. It has never stopped. And so there are many such examples. So one such was, initially the machines were breaking down frequently. And so Lalji Bhai reported this to the mother. And she intervened. And after a while, the problem stopped. The machine stopped breaking down. And when he reported this to the mother explained that when the sugarcane was being crushed, the life force in the sugarcane was upset. And that upset, the anger of the force of the life force being crushed, attacked the machines. So what the mother did was she created an occult formation that the same life force being released was now rerouted and redirected to protect the machines. Now it's life force being released. If you leave it chaotic, well, it does chaos. You direct it and it does order. And he said since that point, they never had any breakdowns or problems with the machine. For decades, literally, the sugar mills continued without breakdowns. What is this occult mechanism? This is the technology. To form and direct energies with a particular formation that whenever those energies come, they flow along. Literally, it's like a machine, except it belongs to gradations of mental, vital, subtle, physical, or even material substance. Now, this being the case, the basic technology behind these weapons, you can understand how one could form a weapon with a specific outcome, even a material outcome, release a vital energy and force of a very powerful kind, and tap into a material location for a violent outcome, including explosive results. And such were some of the weapons of that period. Not all, but many of them were of this kind. Some were of a different kind altogether, not physical explosive results, but killing somebody or killing a large number of people or causing blindness or causing disease or whatever it is that was released. all depended on the nature of the formation put out and the way it was directed. Naturally, all of this, you remember I mentioned, perhaps it was last time or the time before, in Egypt you had all these mummified cats, etc., where they used the energy of these, the shells of their life energies for such means, also for that purpose. But once created now, you can see how the weapon could be held, activated, triggered by a certain formation of words or sounds, symbols, or it could be even attached to a physical object. Now, attaching to a physical object means basically the thing is mental, vital, subtle, physical. You attach to a physical object only for purpose of convenience. You keep that in your pocket, it continues to act, to influence, etc. You could, this is again a technology used by certain extraterrestrial beings in what they call implants. You look at the implant, it's just a piece of metal, you don't see much, sometimes you see unusual things or not. But what you have associated with it is a structure behind, of which the material support binds it to the physical part of the body. But it acts on the subtler gradations of the body in the subtle physical, vital, or even mental, and does something on those levels to protect your health, to amplify your capacities, to give you a special skill, or to open you to a particular power and occult sight, communication, or other skill. So the physical thing inserted is of just a point of support for the rest, which is the actual machinery. Once you understand this, you can see how through all these different traditions, you have sometimes an object, sometimes you don't have an object, you just have a mantra or something which is transmitted, which can be withdrawn, and a mantra which is used to activate. Sometimes it is programmed to be used only once. And you see this also in the Mahabharata war. Certain things, I think this was the weapon given to Ashwathama. I don't know if he could use multiple times. But there were others who, once used, you could not use it again. I think this was the case of Karna. He had been given a weapon which he could use once. And Krishna used a skill. He was reserving it to kill Arjuna. And Krishna created a situation where the person was Ghatotkacha, on whom he had to use it, and to protect Arjuna. These are quite significant interventions of the divine in material circumstances of humanity, which have had massive long-term results. It may seem so trivial, oh, you saved Arjuna, but what that implied for humanity is something so important. The sacrifice of Ghatotkacha was worthwhile. So, in the Mahabharata, you see a very complex play of forces of all kinds, where literally the destiny of humanity is held in the balance. And Sri Krishna plays those forces, manipulates them, organizes them with a skill which could not be done without a spiritual mastery and vision of the circumstances and forces. The full sense of this we will never understand, because we see only the physical steps and the efforts made. Oh, he brought Ghatotkacha in front. But what was behind the perception of all these powers, which were each one enough to perhaps destroy an entire army, all these wielded and held together. And all these powers were held among all these great warriors, occult powers, occult weapons, astras. And as long as this remained in the hands of people who were choosing or bound to be aligned to the wrong, to adharma, to against the truth of a higher evolutionary purpose, humanity was at stake. And these had to be released, consumed, and wiped out even from humanity. When you look at what was done there is so amazing, so extraordinary. Which is why you see at the end of the Mahabharata, all the Kshatriyas, the warrior clan, are wiped out. None left. The little that is left now becomes the seed for a new humanity. But with that, the entire knowledge of all these weapons and technologies is as if withdrawn. The new humanity doesn't have it anymore. So you see these, even sometimes physical, flying chariots, etc., which were physical technologies, all these are withdrawn. Because from that point on begins the Kali Yuga. And such weapons in the hands of the wrong people, or with those who were not aligned to a higher truth, who could not restrain themselves from misusing it, should not be permitted. And so all these were literally wiped out from humanity by their utilization and by their exhaustion, and the further knowledge withdrawn. And those who hold it, well, they just withdrew. Even some of them did not reincarnate, and perhaps some of them now reincarnate when the new rebuilding of humanity and the new age has to begin. But this is to give you the background of the weapons and the circumstances in which all these were deployed, and the mechanism of how these weapons are held. So today even there are textbooks you will find which still survive, where people give you formulas for do this and get a certain wish fulfillment, etc. Some of them also, I'm told, teach you how to kill somebody or launch a negative, harmful intention to harm someone or kill someone, and so on. But relatively they are of a much weaker and poorer grade, depending largely on your own capacity, concentration, energy, intention. But what was held in those things were things which were far more powerful. Some of the explosions of these Brahmastra and others were such that the entire earth would shake. Elephants would be thrown in the air by the force of the shake. And 10,000 suns is the description, I believe, of one of these explosions, which is similar to a nuclear weapon used. People, they describe hair falling off, nails falling off, and so on, which seems so similar to nuclear weapons and the radiation poisoning. But were they nuclear weapons of the modern kind? No, obviously not. Today's weapon is this gigantic thing. We have smaller weapons now, which what they call suitcase bombs, that can destroy a small city, a small town perhaps. But still, there's an object you have to carry, and it's heavy. Perhaps you could miniaturize that with a very advanced technology, and it could be brought to this level of a pebble, and it could, yes, perhaps. So it's possible that some of the weapons were purely physical, but the bulk of them, because they were bound to mantras and things like this, were not purely physical. They had this other dimension, and perhaps with a physical support or not. It was not needed. There is this very interesting incident in the life of the Pandavas when they had to go into incognito mode for 1 year. They hid all the weapons. At the end, when they come out, they go and have to retrieve all their weapons. So it means there was something associated with basic weapons like the arrow and bow, which was associated with a special capacity. The Arjuna's magical bow that you mentioned, Gandiva, was certainly made of perhaps a special material, or had a special strength or special technological form to amplify the ability to release an arrow. But as we understand it, when you release the arrow, you could use the mantra for a specific outcome. And at that point, you are using the physical support of the arrow for something else which is released. In variations to such mantras, a person will take ash or will take a soil, repeat a mantra and throw. Or you can bypass the physical thing completely and just with the gesture of the repetition of mantra, release subtle physical substance. The most pure and the most direct in terms of a spiritual weaponry, if you may use this term, astra, is what you see in the life of Ganapati Muni, who was the first teacher of Kapali Shastriya, and who was the one who recognized Ramana Maharshi. So there's an incident narrated when he was traveling. He came to a village where some of the huts had caught fire and people were shouting and they were looking for water, but the fire spreads very fast. But the moment he saw this, he invoked the mantra from the Veda, what he knew spontaneously, and calling out from deep within with the power of his tapas. I think it was an invocation to Agni, released the force to instantly extinguish the fire. That he could do this was purely a spiritual power. That he leaned upon the mantra was only a point of support. He could perhaps have done it simply by a pure concentration. But the mantra becomes the vehicle now to link the force of his intention and the spiritual power to a physical vibration and as a point of physical support to release something. So you will not find ever the mother of Sri Aurobindo needing to use something like this. when they had to control the rain, I've narrated how Vishwanath Dada, then who became later the head of the construction department as an engineer, he narrates this. When they were building Golconda, they had to lay the entire roof in one continuous process. If you stopped in between, there would be a crack. The entire thing would have to be destroyed and rebuilt. So once they started, the work could not stop. As they began to proceed, the thunderclouds gathered. And so immediately they rushed to the mother. He went personally to the mother and said to mother, this should not rain until this work is done. So mother said, all right, I will go and tell Sri Aurobindo, because the rain gods listen to him more than to me. Very interesting, even as an observation. So she goes and informs Sri Aurobindo. And at that point, it seems he was writing something. He was sitting at his desk. And he just nods. And that's all. And he continues his work. And Vishwanatha described how the clouds gathered and became so heavy. Literally, you could feel and smell the rain in the air, but not a drop fell. And when they finished, and at some point in the middle, Sri Aurobindo sent a message. He sent word, is the work finished? So obviously he was receiving pushback, but he held the rain forces, the rain gods. And at some point when it was done, they had covered it. He informed the mother informed Sri Aurobindo. And the moment she informed Sri Aurobindo, instantly the clouds burst in torrential rain. And the mother explained to Vishwanath that when you hold back, when you interfere with the process of nature, there's always a consequence. You held back long enough, and the force of the rain was, that much stronger. But it's interesting that spontaneous, effortlessly, he could wield his consciousness in these relationships with all powers, energies of all the worlds, simply holding with his will and with his intention. You do not need such techniques, and even it can be extended to a point where if one needed to, one could intervene. All depends on the level from the spiritual action and the degree to which the spiritual force can materialize and master circumstances. Not all spiritual people, and I mentioned this in the first discussion on this topic, not all have this all the way to the material. But those who have also that ability. So this is, I think, a broad explanation of celestial weapons. Flying chariots might still be partly technological. Arjuna's bow might be a special metallurgy or a special formation. Or into it could be infused even a special power, even a vital power to amplify or to be protective in certain ways. I do not know yet what was the form of this Akshay Patra, the magical vessel which provides unlimited supply of food. Perhaps there are formations one could build where literally food could be materialized. There would then be beings associated. So this is another dimension I want to touch. So imagine now you create such a weapon, Astra. It has a mental component, a vital component, subtle physical component, perhaps even a point of physical support. How would you distinguish this from a being who has a mental body, vital body, and subtle physical body? The only thing you might say, it doesn't have a spiritual soul. How would that be different from a being of the vital mental worlds or the subtle physical worlds? Isn't it? So literally, when one creates such a vehicle or instrument by such means, it is and must be treated as a conscious being. So this is the reason why even the astras are treated as beings with due respect, with the conditions required for their action and so on. The being could be used for a one-time exhaustion and then it has no more force. Or it could be as a being that you could gift the access to it to individuals differently or separately. All depends on the nature of the force and the way the being has been built up. Recall again the discussion Mother had regarding these 3 elves that were throwing stones in the guest house. That incident has been narrated many times. When she summoned them and she said They were formed for that work. The magical process was really a process of forming these beings for that specific outcome. So again, the man who does it has no knowledge of it. He is only tapping into a formula. The formula has this effect. Why? Somebody created the formula with that particular force, and that's the weapon, so to say. Now with the formula, you repeat, you trigger this process, you trigger this action, you trigger this machine for the creation of these beings who are now released for a specific outcome. So there's a whole dimension to this which is difficult for us to understand, because unless you have an experience of this or how it works. But literally you're creating beings. Beings and infusing with them or forming around them, in them, a certain power of action, and then holding them with the leash of control which you have programmed into their operation. So coming back to the question of the vessel, the idea was you could ask for any food and it will give you the food. But that day you could allow it to flow only once. Whenever you said enough now, it would stop, and then for the rest of the day you had no access to it. So perhaps that's the way it was formed. Perhaps there is a mechanism and a being behind it who does the materialization. So the being is the technology, is the person, is the machinery, the astra, the yantra for this materialization. And yes, such things can be created in principle. If they can be created in principle, they must have been created at some point. So I suppose that would explain for a lot of some of these descriptions. Is it advanced human or alien or divine gift? To me, it makes no difference. They would be equivalent. If it was a gift from a being of a higher world who has formed this, gives it to you, or a being from a human body consciousness, alien or earth human, it doesn't matter, who has the power to formulate and form this and create this, really the process is the same, the origination is different. So I think that's good enough for today, or shall we? Maybe the next question we can look at the second part, which is a continuation of this, Maya's second.
So we will take a second question from Maya. There are striking similarities in the sacred objects used in both Greek and Hindu mythology. The Greeks also had the bow of Odysseus and horn of cornucopia, blessed by the god Zeus to provide unlimited food. Both Kamadeva, the Hindu god of love, and Eros, the Greek god of love, carry a small enchanted bow and arrows. Poseidon's trident is similar to Shiva's Trishul, and Zeus' thunderbolt is similar to Indra's Vajra. What is the root of these similarities?
It's an interesting observation. You will find sometimes in certain elements of symbolism a one-to-one correspondence between many of the Greek gods and the Indian deities. Except, in the way the Indian deities are described, they still hold their spiritual background. In the way the Greek gods are described, more often than not, you just find them as powerful beings with great powers, but very petty human-like emotions and jealousies and power play, which corresponds to something of the vital world. So it could be that what were originally Vedic deities, which are cosmic, they're everywhere, on all planets, the same. In time, humanity accesses their reflection or their projections on levels which are lower and lower. And in the Greek tradition already it had come to a very low grade. So the symbols remain, but the grade of engagement and interaction become very, very low and almost human-like. They are often more nasty and petty than human beings. Human beings stand out in their generosity compared to these gods and their small jealousies. There was also a time, and this is the part possibly that explains some of this very low human-like jealousy and behavior. There was a time when certain human beings consciously aligned themselves to these deities. So they had the power of the deities, but the pettiness of the human. And they wielded themselves upon other human beings as superior gods. So they lived like that. They created, it was an occult formation. And they lived like that with those powers. And human beings could go and meet them representing those deities or having those powers. But still being largely human essentially. So it could be that there was a phase like this, which is what leaves the remnant impression of their human frailty and even sometimes vulnerability to material harm. But still, the parallel is strong because in their origin, these are Vedic deities which are cosmic, universal, across all planets, across all civilizations. Once you tap into that level, you will find them all similar. Vocabulary or reduction of the symbol to your type and need might be there, but what you perceive would be in origin similar or the same. I think we'll complete the rest of the questions rapidly.
So Maya, last week you mentioned crystals. Can gemstones too, such as the Kohinoor, really carry good fortune or curses? And also from Gim Morst, what about precious gems?
Yes, Gim some truth. That's the name.
Yeah, that's the nickname.
What about gems, crystals, and what they can carry? So, on a purely material level, the crystalline structure has very precise spacing of atoms or molecules, which makes it naturally a resonator for very precise frequencies. So when you want to broadcast a radio of a particular frequency, that particular frequency is easily got for that particular crystal because that spacing is now precise. So look at it another way. If you set a pendulum to be of a particular length with weight, then it has a natural resonance. The pace is set of its swing. Now if out there's a sound which is precisely tuned to this swing, when you play that sound, this will swing. Or when you swing, it will create that frequency of sound. So these are essentially, crystals are resonators and some of the best and most pure resonators. Quite a large part of the most advanced technology of today of what we call meta materials. And these are materials where materials have such extraordinary qualities that go beyond the material, the underlying material itself. The difference is the layout of the molecules or atoms. By laying them out in specific ways, at specific angles, with specific associations, you are playing with the natural resonance frequencies of the ether, which is the underlying reality. And activating those frequencies, concentrating those frequencies, or by that resonance, activating specific qualities of the ether, which becomes the basis for those materials. So quite a lot is happening with graphene. And if you take graphene, which is single layer of atoms, of carbon atoms, and you place a second layer of carbon atoms, not exactly aligned, but off by an angle of some 4.6 degrees, I don't remember exactly, but something like that. Suddenly you find that between them there is something which is nearly like a superconductor. How? Why? It's purely from the resonance of these spacings. So crystals naturally tend to be resonators. For what? For those grades. Now if this is true at a material level, it is also true of a subtle grade, subtle, physical, vital, mental or otherwise. This is the basis for a lot of the technology around precious gems, gemstones, semi-precious. Many of these are associated with certain planetary vital influences. Remember, the so-called planets in astrology are essentially vital beings or vital influences associated with the planet. There is a spiritual dimension behind, but primarily astrology taps into their vital influence through which they influence material circumstances. Again, to an extent, one of the factors of influence. So if a gem particularly has a natural resonance to that, by wearing that gem, you are as if aligning to that influence and amplifying it on you. So the idea is, if in your horoscope a particular planet is weak, you wear that gem to amplify that particular vibration in you to compensate for that weakness and make up for that lack. This is the idea basically. So this becomes the basis of a science. Does it work? To an extent, on that level. But once you understand the science, the rest is very simple. From a spiritual point of view, you could tune into that quality of consciousness and invoke that into you and get the same result. Interesting, isn't it? Or, what the mother did sometimes, she would take an object concentrate, infuse into it that particular vibration and give it to the person. And the person receiving it, retaining the object on the body, in the room nearby, or simply absorbing the vibration that came to it, and you had the result that you needed. But for that, you don't need to know anything. You don't need to know any of this lower grade of technology. You just feel, draw, and infuse, and that's it. So you can see how the same result could be acquired directly by spiritual means, indirectly by vital means, and even more indirectly by physical vital means, which would be the nature of the gemstones and so on. Upon that, some of these materials are very sensitive to vibrations of certain types. So we are told, I don't remember, I'm not an expert in this. I was only interested in the science, so I studied to that extent that it helped me to understand. I remember vaguely reading that quartz is associated with a protective influence, etc. But the idea being, it influences a particular quality, or it resonates with a particular quality which has that effect. Now, if that be the case, you could also piggyback on it a certain mental, vital, subtle physical substance, intention, content, the way we described earlier with the astras or the weapons. And you could infuse into a crystal a certain vibration, positive or negative. If it is positive, it would continue to radiate because it's a natural radiator. That vibration, along with whatever base vibration it naturally has from the crystalline structure. And because the crystalline structures have specific frequencies or vibrations on a material level, there's an equivalent in the vital or mental levels also. So you can as if tap into that, amplify that, or use that as the point of support to amplify powers or energies, or wield those powers, energies on that grade using that as a vehicle, etc. A lot can be done. So let's say you have goodwill for a person, and this particular gemstone vibrates on a level which is vital, mental. You infuse that goodwill, and now this vibration that it puts out resonates with the goodwill, or the goodwill uses this as the, what is the word in radio waves? We call this the carrier frequency. So in the radio waves, there is one fixed frequency, and you modulate its amplitude with your message, the voice vibration. So there's a carrier frequency of the crystal resonance, upon which you infuse the vital, mental, or other intent. Even it could hold a spiritual intent. So there are things which are naturally aligned to certain kinds of things they can hold, but in principle you could take any crystal and infuse, in principle, anything. But if you could do that with a crystal, with a spiritual power, you can do it with anything. So, and I'm extending the technology which we touched upon last time. Flowers, being essentially vibrational in the level of the psychic quality of consciousness, would be then most suited for transmitting in psychic vibration or through psychic content the spiritual force, which is why the mother used the flowers. Crystals are more on the vital, physical, etc. So not of much use for this purpose, and you don't need it. You could still do it, but you could do it the same even with the flower petal, and you would not be in any way less effective because the action is primarily spiritual. So all this is to just give you the larger technology behind, the understanding behind, but also the superior method available through spiritual means. Yes, so they can carry positive intentions, they can carry negative intentions, they can carry the jealousy of a person who has held that gem for a long time and who has always said anybody who takes this away will be harmed, and has put that energy of harm. And if that crystal is taken, the gem is taken by somebody against the will of that other person, there could be an associated formation that continues to radiate harm. If you have the occult knowledge or the spiritual power, you could neutralize that, dissolve that, replace it with a positive thing, and so on. So a lot can be done. You're not bound to those good fortune or curses, but mostly the fact that you believe in it feeds it and supports it, or even creates it in some cases. So that's the rationale for these gems. And we'll go with the last question then.
May I ask fourth question, or do you want the closing?
Yes. We'll do that. Let's finish this fourth. So we'll finish the topic today.
The vaults underneath the Padma Bhavasmi temple have been found to contain immense treasures and wealth. The last vault B has not been opened yet, and from what I read, The Travancore royal family believed that disturbing the vault would desecrate the temple and disrupt centuries-old rituals. Can you please shed some light on this and what you think it's inside? It feels like a portion of the wealth of ancient India has been carefully preserved for the time when India will rise again. In the future, how should the wealth and sacred objects belonging to ancient Indian temples be managed?
Yes, often it was the responsibility of the kings to not only dig wells, lakes, and make sure the water table was replenished, which is the very opposite of what we do today, but it was also to offer the wealth of the kingdom to the temple, to the deity, and it was to be reused in times of distress whenever required, but the wealth belonged to the deity always. So it was a way of physically expressing what was known in a higher spiritual, cultural sense. That tradition continuing for a long time. Many of the temples had vaults where these things were stored. It was also a way of supporting craftsmen who created works of wonder and art through these things of wealth. When the invasion started from the Middle East, they targeted the temples for two reasons. One was, of course, the usual narrow intolerance associated with many of these coarser traditions that destroys anything which they don't understand or which is represents a truth that they refuse, but also for the loot of the wealth. So they would come and destroy the temples, take away the wealth, and it was huge wealth. As we see in just one case, Padmanabha Swami temple is one of the few which was not looted by these oppressors. Nobody knew the huge wealth which was under, and it was only because of some very mischievous elements that the courts in India ordered for these doors to be opened. One of the doors was opened, and they found such huge amount of gold wealth that they said it could literally shift the whole economic condition of the country. But for what? What would you do? You'd have to take that out and sell the gold and melt it. Then only you'd get the economic benefit. For what again? And how would you really use it? So, if you look at the idea behind, the intention behind, and you draw from it, you could actually recover something very beautiful from ancient India's traditions. And there's still a second vault which was not opened, and there's a lot of spiritual or occult objectives behind to protect and not open. For many, there was the idea that it would desecrate something, or that there was a curse associated with opening, etc. Maybe there is something vital or not. I don't know. It's not important. But the fact of the wealth and the fact that it was done with such genuine intent, and the king of royal family continued to donate every year wealth, which continued to be stored in these chambers. None of the priests ever stole. None of the kings ever stole. The stealers were only the invaders, the barbarians. Later, the British also did their part in such things. But sometimes there were protective powers, as you see in Egypt, where over the chamber, Tutankhamun's tomb or others, they had this kind of a curse or a warning. And they created actually vital formations for the purpose of protection. All 5 people who went into Tutankhamun's tomb died mysteriously by accident within a few years, under unusual circumstances. Of course, if you look up the atheists, they will say, oh yeah, but that was an accident, this was an illness. But the fact that they all died within a few years shows you that the curse acted through circumstances, obviously. You look at circumstances, you'll say there's no curse. You look at the pattern, you'll say, obviously there was a curse. But there was also this observation the mother made. Some of the mummies and the being present there did not like being mistreated, and it puts out this strong reaction to being mistreated, which acts as a curse. And so there are things like this also. I do not know if these temples had some such protection or not. But generally, wherever strong wealth has been held, there is a strong vital force associated with it. Often it takes the form of a serpent. So they'll say snakes guarding, which is true on the vital level. If you go in your subtle body, you might see snake-like beings who are there to protect. But it may not always be true on a physical level. How sacred is the object? I don't know. I don't think the objects are infused with sacredness. They are just to be treated as offerings to the temple and the temple deity, and that's about all. I don't think there's a materiality to the sacredness there. But what one could do is at least to recognize these are great cultural symbols and even evidence of technology and skills going back a very, very long time, far longer than what we are told today. We are given the impression that this technology was only recent. It is not. It has been for a very long time. Even the knowledge of the use of gold and silver and other metallurgical knowledge goes back to Vedic times, which at the very least would be 7,000 to 9,000 years ago. So maybe in here you might just find evidence for things going back a very long time. So I would approach this question in many other ways. I don't see immediately a spiritual value to it. But yes, there's a kind of a desecration to the intentions of the people who hold, and I wish it could be done with greater love and respect for what is in there and not purely in monetary terms. To simply melt the gold and sell it would be the most stupid thing one could do. But if you could treat it as a cultural treasure and even a representation of the value system which made for this, that would be valuable. But it's not just this temple. There are a few other temples which still hold it. One would hope that we would not know what those temples are, so that it is not looted by the state governments, because many politicians would misuse this. Many thieves would dig holes through the ground. I don't know if the government of India has done enough to protect this. There are people who will dig tunnels, going long enough even to get into those spaces and steal everything. And a lot of such efforts might be already on. Not enough effort to protect, which is sad. But there are other places in India where the wealth has been hidden, not in a temple. There was this story that at the end of when the civilization which was formed around Krishna Deva Raya's lineage and the great for several centuries that it lasted, of which today you see only the remnants. You had that entire space which had such great wealth. Even now you can see the place where they were melting gold to create gold coins, continuously producing gold coins. And there was obviously some occult dimension, because the Rishi who initiated this whole thing created a rain of gold, it is said. So there are things perhaps associated with this which were used later even for the wealth of the kingdom. And when it was finally overrun by the Islamic invaders, they supposedly buried the wealth. And to this day nobody knows, nobody has found it supposedly. And the entire army stayed there for 2.5 years, I believe, destroying every single wall and pillar and temple and well, looking for the wealth. And after 2.5 years they were exhausted, they just went back. And that's why you see very little remaining of that whole kingdom. But this day the wealth is still present. Possible. Perhaps there is much more. There is much more evidence of records of the past cycle of civilization still stored, as in the Great Pyramid. We're told there is a place in the Himalayas where this is preserved also physically. And then there are, of course, subtle physical domains where so much has also been preserved. So all this is intended to be revealed at some point when humanity outgrows its current semi-barbaric value system. And if as a nation we come into our own and can now meet this knowledge and the wealth and the power that it would give in the right way, then perhaps that would be the time when these things will be exposed. And that's all I can say about what might be there. Last question we will end.
And our closing question from Rumpel: what should we do with our belongings when we grow old and are ready to die?
First correction to the question: you never die. So I would reword it as when you're ready to leave your body. And even leave your body is not the end. I would add to that, When you're ready to leave your body in order to take on another body which is younger so that you may continue the work that you're doing. That puts the real context. So what do? You leave behind objects that you can't carry over into the new life that you want to take. That's really the question. So what do you do with those objects? It depends. Some things have purely sentimental value for you and may have no other further purpose for you even in your next life, but for others in their lives. And those perhaps you can dispose of suitably. There'll be things which have value for others, and you would make sure that they go to the right people so that they may be used with the right value and respect. And then there are things which have a special sacred spiritual value. And those perhaps you have to ensure that they go correctly to those who will value for the spiritual content. I know for a fact that there were many people in Pondicherry who did not ensure that these things were correctly passed on when they left their body, as you say, when they died. Those who came to take the material saw no use in it, disposed, discarded, threw in the waste bin, sold off books and papers, which went to the resellers of books. If the same thing had happened today, then they would simply go into the landfill, get burnt, incinerated somewhere. Fortunately, in those days, because of extreme poverty, any books sold were gathered by these second-hand booksellers and repurposed and sold back to anyone who wanted books. Today with the internet, nobody wants books, so they just burn them. But at that time, they would sell them to those who wanted to buy cheap. And there was one person in the ashram, Limaye, he was a Marathi man, teacher in the school. He would go every week on his bicycle to these resellers of second-hand waste paper and second-hand books and go through all the books, and he would find inevitably over the years books signed by Sri Aurobindo and the mother, which had just been thrown off, discarded. It still happens. Because the person who had them, or objects used by the mother and Sri Aurobindo which were given to them, oh, I value it, I leave it. One day when I leave, there's no one to say this is what it is. They did not label it. They did not package it. They did not mark it. They did not pass it to somebody who would value it suitably or who would know what it means. And the matter has been discarded, lost, destroyed. So I would simply say, if you know you're about to leave, well, give it to somebody who would value those things at least. In many cases, it has happened that the person has left. The children of those people had no value for the spiritual, blessed or otherwise spiritual things, and threw them, sold them, or destroyed them, which also we know so many cases. So I would make the classification over these three things. What has no more use for anyone, you dispose in a way that is recycled. What can be used by others, you pass on. And what is of very special spiritual value, well, you will give to somebody who will value it for its spiritual content. I remember Huta, when she prepared her will, she explained this to many people. And she put labels behind the TV. She said, this will go to my sister, this will go to this will go to that. And she had labeled those objects, and other things she had put for her trust. And she had certain things which were blessed by the mother, which she had kept carefully. And unfortunately, I was out of station when she left her body. And when I asked about it later, nobody knew. Obviously, somebody had come in and taken away many of those things, including audio cassettes of mother's voice recording, which she had carefully kept, but somebody had taken away. And I don't know who. I asked many times. Nobody would say, nobody knew, supposedly. So yes, these things happen. I don't know where it is. Perhaps the person who has taken it now is embarrassed to say, I have it, because they would have taken it. Whether they label it or not, now it will probably get destroyed in time because he would have kept it secret. And then when he goes, people will say, oh, what do you do with old cassettes? Throw them. Not realizing this as mother's voice. By then, even the tape recorders or players would not be available to verify what it is. Nothing has been written on it. So much will be lost if you don't protect those things. So this is all I can say from that point of view of objects. Then I come to something else more important. Physical objects, yes. What about your spiritual content? Will you leave behind with your physical body and elements of the vital mental body that you shed the work done for your spiritual evolution or the content of your growth? Obviously not. how will you carry that into the next? Or what will be carried into the next? And this is the crucial question you must ask yourself. Can you carry what is really valuable and learned in this life into the next? And I think rather than elaborating on this because it needs a whole larger discussion, I would suggest that we take up this topic for our next session. And Sri Aurobindo has given a very clear answer of how can one carry over the content of our existing consciousness into the next life. And we'll take up that as well as things around it. And this will be of great use for us. So we look back at the theme of the sacred objects. We have covered 4 sessions around it. And we'll shift to a different theme now, but aligned to this. The most important thing to recall, it's not an object which is sacred. It is the presence which is sacred. And to the extent the presence is there, or a remnant of its imprint, there is a sacredness. The presence seen from a certain perspective is in all things, and therefore the entire universe is sacred. Divine substance, in evolution, concealed in its divinity. But certain objects have a special infusion of presence and force which is actively thriving, radiating, influencing, impacting circumstances, and can be a support to even your spiritual growth. In such cases, we call those things sacred objects. And we have discussed the various kinds of influences which could be there, not all of which are spiritual. We discussed various ways by which this presence could be invoked, evoked, or indirectly drawn into. We discussed what is needed to preserve, contain it so that it does not dissipate or does not get replaced by other influences. And all the other questions which followed were around this. So with this, we will close this topic with the final statement. The most precious thing, the most sacred object in the universe, as far as you are concerned, is your physical body. In this, there is 1 billion years of evolution gathered, and your individual evolution, and your soul's aspiration, and the grace and blessings of the Divine Mother infused into it. This is your most sacred physical object, which has the potential to become a divinized spiritual being. That potential perhaps is still somewhat far, but in the other layers, at least some degrees of this divinization can be made. So take care of your body as an instrument for the spiritual realization, if nothing else, for the manifestation of the divine will through the mind, through the life energies, through your actions and your will on earth. So from an evolutionary point of view, this is your single most important responsibility. Put it to right use for the evolution, individual, collective, and for the action of the divine will to work in the world, in you and through you. This would be the most important focus of our effort. Let's take a moment to concentrate in this aspiration.